Chapter 11, Going to the Dark Side. Manos has heart. It's like an Ed Wood film. Although the quality isn't there, you can tell it's a labor of love. People love Manos in the same way that we put our kids' drawings on the fridge, while the work of art school educated artists end up on the walls of cheap motels. Sometimes we recognize the pure intention of a work, the earnestness of the endeavor, in spite of the actual skill involved. This perception can strike like lightning in group consciousness, unpredictable in when and where it will strike. And sadly, sometimes when it does, there's an opportunist with a bottle trying to grab that lightning for themselves. Strange things can and do happen when people mistakenly think they are entitled to control something just because they've convinced themselves they have that right. As more facts pile up, their belief increases until they are frenetic and aggressive in bending others to their will. Such is the case with Manos, the Hands of Fate, in the battle that ensued in the attempt to prove that the film should be owned and controlled by one man and his bearded, stumbling sidekick. My response to them is, don't believe everything you think. It all started innocently enough in June 2010. I first learned of Philip Francis from a music video he posted on YouTube titled Take It Easy, Torgo Style, which can be found online at www.torgolives.com. I thought the music video was actually pretty good, so I contacted him just to say that I liked it. He started right in talking about a film project he wanted to do and asked if I'd be interested. His basic story idea revolved around an adult Debbie and her journey to gain retribution for the suffering inflicted upon her family by the Manos cult. Within weeks, he had a massive script for a Manos sequel that had morphed from the initial short film he described into a modern-day Homer's Odyssey. He even displayed the character Odysseus' heroic trait of cunning intelligence, most often manifest by his use of disguise and deceptive speech. The first time we spoke on the phone, a man answered claiming to be Rupert Talbot Munch Sr. and speaking in an odd Australian New Zealand accent. Once he was sure of who I was, his accent disappeared and he went on to tell me about several projects in the works concerning Manos and wanted to know if I'd be interested in participating. I thought the whole fake accent and name thing odd, but then again, we're talking Manos. I met quite a few eccentric types along the way in the world of fandom, so I shrugged it off. He explained to me how he wanted to shroud his Manos projects in mystery to create more interest. I suspected the alter ego he created was to protect his real life in the event things didn't work out so that he could slip back into oblivion. I told Phil I'd be interested in participating in just about anything Manos related. And up to that point, my experience with fans, journalists, and the like had all been fun and games. I've always been a why not attitude and would rather make a few ridiculous choices along the way than reach the end of my life regretting all that I had not done. Risky, but stimulating. But that's how I roll. With a belief in powerful guardian angel assistance, my philosophy works out all right most of the time. And when it doesn't, I cherish the stinging lesson and determine to grow from it. Phil had certainly come to the right place to get support for his new epic project. He told me he'd attended Comic-Con in San Diego for a couple years as Torgo and wanted to continue developing his version of the character, hoping to connect with Riff Tracks, Cinematic Titanic, and anyone else in an effort to gain credible support. His ultimate goal, he told me, was to be the best Torgo ever. Excuse me. Oh my, not me. No, it's not Corona. During this whole time, Phil was engaged in the making of his Manos sequel, The Search for Valley Lodge. He presented himself to all but the innermost circle as Rupert Talbot Munch Sr. and spoke with an odd accent that would come and go. Sometimes he would play the part of Torgo too, slipping unintentionally between all three personas. Phil also resembled Hal Warren in his relentless determination to get what he wanted. I watched it all. The posturing, the antics, the bullying, the chumminess, with a morbid astonishment. I often had to admire his resolve while being shocked at his methods. Phil had Hal's gift of gab and had early on convinced me to connect him with Dad, who agreed to play a cameo as the master. I had already agreed to play the lead role of Debbie Morgan, a grown version of Little Debbie from the original Manos. He contacted Brian Jennings to play the sheriff and Diane Marie to reprise her role as Maggie. To bring in a wider audience, he recruited celebrities from other genres. Gene Snitsky, 6'8" former star of World Wrestling Entertainment fame, and martial artist Ryan, the Big Deal Jimmo, former Canadian light heavyweight champion in the Maximum Fight Championship, MFC. Phil convinced Joe Warren, Hal, and Norma's son to play a character named Joe. Phil also asked if I would be interested as an artist in creating the art and many of the props for his film, just as Dad had in the original film. I would be able to sell copies of my work with his help and make more money. That man could talk for an hour and a half with barely a breath. He used flattery, but had little interest in any interruption to his diatribe. With a somewhat skeptical, "It sounds too good to be true, but what the heck" attitude, I said, "Sure, let's see where this goes." I became Phil's reluctant confidant when he would call to deliver monologues lasting an hour or longer, taking over any interjection unless he wanted my advice. I hung up on him once as he yelled at me not to dare, but I mostly went along, convincing myself for a while that this was just his creative method. Once I truly became cognizant of the mess I got myself and Dad into, I felt trapped because there were now so many other people invested in the project. I imagine that's a bit like how the original Manos went down for the actors who took the bait in 1966. Over the next year, Phil called often, going on about how, if his film ever made money, Dad and I would be compensated with percentages that are unheard of in the movie business. Everyone thought he was crazy to offer so much, he said, and nobody but him would do such a thing. All of these promises were verbal, and he carefully avoided mentioning what kind of numbers. He talked about how we would share in all the merchandising and that he had already worked a deal with an action figure company to make Manos action figures, including a Debbie one. That man could talk. The first scenes were filmed May 2011 in my town of Falls City to accommodate Dad, who would not travel. Phil came to Oregon from Texas, and the director of cinematography, Jay Lee, from Los Angeles. They stayed in my home since the town is so small and there's not even a motel, not even a gas station. Jay Lee is a Hollywood cameraman and filmmaker who had some good experience in filmmaking and already had one feature film under his belt, Zombie Strippers, starring famous porn star Jenna Jameson. Rick Zunk, my good friend and neighbor, had started doing some filmmaking of his own and was interested in being involved, so I insisted that he be one of the cameramen. His work earned him the title of Assistant Director of Photography. Also along for the ride were Eric Huber and Andy Cope of Lone Star Films out of Austin, Texas. Phil had orchestrated them to document the making of the sequel to the worst movie ever made. Andy Cope is the grandson of the original Manos sheriff, William Bryan Jennings, and had a personal family interest in the project. Eric and Andy stayed at Rick's house, having more fun than we did at mine. For the scene we were shooting, Dad would reprise the role of the master and wear the original robe that my mom had made. Phil had convinced Joe Warren to ship the original master's robe that his father had held on to and that Joe had worn for many a Halloween. It was sent with the express condition that we return it immediately after the shooting, which we reluctantly did. What a thrill for Dad and me when we opened the box to see the robe that my mother had so expertly sewn 44 years ago. It was such a pleasure to see, touch, and remember my mother's work. And I longed for her to be alive to have this experience for herself. By the end of 2011, Phil had gotten his hands on enough money to do another shoot. This time in El Paso, where he assembled the main cast, including Gene Snitsky, Ryan Jimmo, Brian Jennings, Diane Marie, and me. We also had Jay Lee, Rick Zunk, the documentary team, and some local actors and support. We all flew to El Paso for 5 days to shoot our location scenes, except for Diane, who had driven with her boyfriend, Tom, from her home in Colorado. By the second day, everyone was getting a much clearer view of Phil's business strategy and what he termed as his wacky deals. Things were getting tense. Some of the local help revolted when they found out they were being duped by a guy pretending to be someone else. By the end of the shoot, everyone was feeling frayed and frustrated. Phil had run out of money again and had no luck at raising additional funds. Time to switch course. He joined forces with Hal's son, convincing Joe that he had heroically found the original copyright for Manos. This meant that anyone doing Manos-related projects from then on would be subject to paying licensing fee, which would provide him with the money to finish the film. In Phil's mind, and now Joe's, it was a brilliant scheme. We will see you for the next half of Chapter 11.